All right, well, as we continue to try to get a big picture understanding of the Bible, in this video, we are going to look at the different genres of the Bible. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that term, all a genre is it's a category of literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. And so it's basically a type of writing or a category of writing. Now, maybe you're thinking, why is this important for the Bible? This isn't like high school English class. Well, the reason why is because many people are confused thinking that the Bible is ordered chronologically, but it's not. The books of the Bible are actually grouped by genre. And so we have these 66 books of the Bible that we learned about in the last video, but they are not all in chronological order. Instead, they are grouped by genre. And this is really important to understand if you're going to understand the flow of the Bible, if you're going to be able to read the Bible and understand where you're going. See, a lot of people get confused because they think the Bible is chronological. So they assume that you start on page 1 in Genesis 1, and you're going to read it through kind of like it's a novel, and you're going to end in the book of Revelation. That'll be the end of the story. But it really doesn't work like that. The Bible is broken down by these different types of writing or categories of writing called genres. And so let's look now at a few of these genres that are in the Bible. There are 5 main categories of genre in the Bible. They are history, wisdom and poetry, prophecy, epistle, and apocalyptic. Now, let me just say that these designations always aren't absolutely pure. There's a lot of overlap between them. There's a lot of mixing of genres within certain books, and even in the category, for example, you see there of wisdom and poetry. I've combined them because there's so much overlap between those two genres, but it's helpful to understand those 5 main categories that the Bible is written in. So let's look at each of these genres. First, look at history. History, like it sounds, these are narrative accounts that describe historical people and events in the Bible. And now this is important because these are real people and real events that the Bible is describing. And so these are historical accounts of what was going on. In the Old Testament, we have the historical accounts of the nation of Israel and the people involved around Israel. In the New Testament, we have the historical accounts of Jesus and the early Christian church. And so you see all this history described. And so in the Old Testament, you have several historical books, starting in the book of Genesis and going through the book of Esther. Those first books of the Bible are all historical books. Now, those aren't necessarily in chronological order, but those are all considered historical books. And then also there are historical portions of the book of Daniel and the book of Jonah in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the history books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are called the Gospels because they tell the story of Jesus. And so all those first 4 books are kind of the same story of Jesus told from 4 different perspectives. Then you have the book of Acts, which is a historical record of the founding and the growth of the first Christian church as it spread throughout the known world. And so those are the historical books. And then you come to the next genre, which is wisdom and poetry. And again, we've combined those, but really they're distinct, and yet there's a lot of overlap between them. So look at them. First, you have wisdom. These are collections of wise sayings and maxims that are, some of them are very spiritual in nature, some are just really practical and physical in nature. Then you have poetry, and this is the use of really expressive and imaginative, poetic type language that's often written in structured form. Now, when you think about the wisdom books, some of the examples of this are Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, full of these wise sayings. Then you come to the poetic books, and you have examples like Psalms and Song of Solomon. And let me just mention, there's also some elements of poetry in some of the New Testament books as well. Now, one of the things that's important to understand is that though these books are often considered poetry, it's not poetry like you might think. Maybe you're expecting poetry to rhyme, but poetry doesn't rhyme usually in the Bible. There's all sorts of structured poetry that usually doesn't involve rhyming. For example, a common poetic form is the use of alphabetical order. So often you'll have a chapter that has 22 verses, each that start with a different letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Example of that is Psalm 34, where each verse of that chapter begins with the next letter in alphabetical order of the Hebrew alphabet. And so oftentimes you don't see that in the English translation, but yet there is a lot of poetic structure throughout these books. And then the next prophecy we're going going to look at here is prophecy. Now, what prophecy is divinely inspired declarations of God's truth, and occasionally this contains proclamations of future events. Now, usually when we think of prophecy, we only think about future predictions, but that's actually not the majority of prophecy in the Bible. These are these bold declarations of God's truth, and then sometimes the truth deals with future events. Now, the different prophetic books of the Bible are broken down into two subcategories called minor prophets and major prophets. Now, they are not major or minor because of their importance, but simply because of their size. The major prophetic books are a little bit longer, and the minor prophetic books are shorter. That's it. And so some examples of the major prophets, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, the book of Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then some of the minor prophets, you've got Hosea, Joel, Amos, and then on through the rest of those. These are the books that wrap up the Old Testament. Now, this next genre we're going to look at, it's only contained in the New Testament, that is, epistle. And what an epistle is simply it's a letter, a formal letter, and that always contains an identification of who's writing the letter and who's receiving the letter, and then the body of the letter, and then usually some sort of a formal closing. And this is what comprises most of the New Testament. Of the 27 books of the New Testament, 21 of them are epistles or letters. And again, these are letters written to a specific audience, but are very practical for us today as well. And so as you read each of these epistles, they read just like a letter written from someone to an individual or a group of people. And this last genre we're going to look at is called apocalyptic. And this is actually sort of a subset of prophecy, but it's a more particular or specific form of prophecy where it's written in very vivid and sometimes hyperbolic imagery designed to foretell coming events in the future. And apocalyptic literature, it often warns us about future events, and sometimes we don't fully understand what it's always saying, that the full meaning is often sort of intentionally hidden. It's sort of written in almost secretive language, meant to sort of give us a glimpse of what's going to happen, but not really to give us a full understanding. But yet we have these symbols and this imagery, which is supposed to give us a hint of what is coming again in the future. Now, there is some apocalyptic literature found in the books of Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel and Zechariah in the Old Testament. Most of Daniel is actually very apocalyptic in nature. And then you have in the New Testament the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book, again, foretelling about the end of time when the Lord will come back. And so that is just a brief overview of the different genres in the Bible. And again, this is important to understanding the overall flow and big picture of the Bible, because you always have to understand what genre you're in when you're reading a book of the Bible. So why don't you go ahead and pause now and take a minute and look at some of these questions and discuss them.